We now understand what evolution is and how it occurs. We've also gone over some mechanisms of change, and I highlighted natural selection, which is the process by which some individuals are more likely to pass on their genes than others if the traits that they are passing on give a reproductive advantage. That is, it allows them to more often successfully reproduce compared to their competitors, compared to other individuals within a population of species. What I'd like to do next is delve a little more deeply into natural selection and discover what it creates. And in that process, we're going to try to answer the question of whether evolution and natural selection has shaped psychology. So to tackle this question, we first need to review something called adaptations. So an adaptation is going to be the result of natural selection very often. An adaptation is a trait which has consistently provided a reproductive advantage because it solved an adaptive problem. That is, this is going to be some trait, some genetically controlled trait that, because it's been passed on from generation to generation, it has provided that reproductive advantage. You start to see it more and more and more within a particular species. And at a certain point, what might happen is that trait becomes so common that it becomes a defining feature of that species. Humans have a number of these traits, of these adaptations. Some adaptations we share with other species. That is, it was so successful, it was such a good trait that not only do we have it, other animals also have it. And there are certain traits that humans uniquely have that other animals do not. It's important to note that only natural selection produces adaptations. That is, you are only going to have this trait move towards ubiquity. That is, it's in every single species if it's actually conferring a reproductive advantage. If it's not, you might end up getting something like genetic drift, where a trait just fluctuates in frequency within the population randomly. That's not going to produce an adaptation. So I mentioned adaptive problem. This trait has to solve an adaptive problem. Very simply, an adaptive problem is something that decreases reproductive success. So we are talking about traits that offset, that decrease the chance that your reproductive success will be decreased. So it improves your reproductive success. So that's what an adaptive problem is. It's something that gets in the way. It's something that makes it harder for an organism to reproduce, to make copies of itself. Well, what might reduce reproductive success? What kind of adaptive problems exist? What kinds of things could get in the way of someone successfully reproducing? Well, probably the most common and easiest to understand adaptive problem are predators, right? Predators are any organism that hunt down other organisms. That is, within the food chain, these are individuals who are going to eat something lower in the food chain. Humans have, for a very long time, had a number of predators, large animals especially, that were capable of killing them. Now we have essentially become the predators. We have become, our technological advancements have allowed us to really solve many of the predatory problems that we used to have. We don't have to worry about wolves anymore. We don't have to worry about large cats. We don't have to worry about bears as much. If you're in a relatively more rural area, that may not be true. And yet you may have weaponry that most humans, for most of human existence, did not have. Guns and the like, and very effective composite bows, things like that, bows and arrows. Well, because we didn't always have these technological advancements, we did end up having and developing psychological advancements, traits that once they popped up within the population, they ended up being passed on from generation to generation because they were so successful. For example, there is a fair amount of research on this phenomenon where people tend to be accurate above chance simply from watching someone's movement. That is the way that they walk. People can, at above chance, guess how vulnerable someone is to attack. Now, they've done these kinds of research. This is very interesting research where they use what are called point light walkers. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but they put these patches on the joints of people. So they have people wear a bodysuit, and then that bodysuit has these white fluorescent patches at the joints, so at the knees, at the elbows, et cetera, et cetera. And what you can get is if you turn off all the lights such that you can only see those points on the joints, you can then monitor how someone is moving. That is, record what's called their gait, kind of the style in which they walk. Well, it turns out certain styles of walking actually are more vulnerable than others. If you want to protect yourself well, how you should walk is you should keep your legs relatively further apart, not wide-hipped or anything, but keep your feet relatively further apart. You want to be standing upright. Usually your shoulders should be swaying with your body. And what that does is it allows you to, if anything were to happen, your body would already be in motion and capable of switching motion. Or in the case of having your legs further apart, if someone were to come out and attack you, try to tackle you, or try to trip you, having your feet further apart allows you to ground yourself more. Well, they've had people actually watch these point light walkers and assess how vulnerable these people are to attack. And the idea is that even humans themselves have this evolved machinery, these psychological adaptations for identifying potential targets. We no longer really have to worry about wolves. We don't have to worry about bears, things like that. But the predators we do still have to worry about are each other. We've shifted from a world where humans worry about other species to a world where we care about each other, especially living in relatively more modern societies where you'll be interacting with people who may not be genetically related to you as your family. So the idea is we have evolved these, psychological adaptations for recognizing essentially weakness in others. And we've also evolved certain tactics for preventing predation as well. So when you see someone who might be about to cheat you or someone who seems like they might be lying to you, we do tend to almost have like that third sense for detecting, okay, so there's something not right about what you're telling me, or you seem like a little slimy to me. Those are intuitions that are informed by kind of certain kind of gut instinctual information processing that allows you to avoid being cheated, avoid predation. So, although traditionally, the traditional predators of something coming out and eating you probably isn't as much of a problem anymore, we do have this long history of predation, of needing to defend ourselves. And as we go through the class, I think I'll point out a few more of these kind of predator-inspired adaptations. Disease is something else that can reduce reproductive success. So this is a big one, right now, is what kinds of adaptations against disease do we have? Some people are especially sensitive to disease, but almost everyone, if you, for example, if you smell rotten meat, or if milk has started to go bad, or if you see blood, or if you see feces or smell feces, you smell poop or urine, people will have a disgust response. They'll have that gagging response. That's automatic. You don't really have to think about the fact that you're disgusted by certain things. What that is it's protective. It's a protective psychology such that if milk is spoiled, if meat is spoiled, you should stay away from it because it's likely to be growing things that could make you sick, bacteria, fungi, etc., that could get you sick. So being disgusted by that keeps you away from things that would potentially harm you and make you sick. There are plenty of blood-borne diseases, another reason why many people are squeamish by blood. And of course, bodily fluids and things that come out of your body, people tend to find that disgusting as well because those too can harbor diseases. There are plenty of gut-borne diseases that if you come in contact with someone else's feces or urine, not so much urine, but especially feces, you can transmit those diseases. So we have a disease avoidance psychology. And that is why we feel disgust. And so I've already mentioned this, although we don't have traditional predators, we do have other members of the same species, and we have several adaptations that seem to help us to avoid those kinds of situations. So if you take a biology class, you may learn about adaptations. Well, we're going to specifically focus on psychological adaptations. So we're talking about heritable, that is, they can be passed on from generation to generation through genes, heritable mental traits that solved a recurrent adaptive problem, an adaptive problem that popped up again and again and again. Well, one of these adaptations that is, again, fairly ubiquitous, you see it everywhere you go, in every known human society, is fear. Since humans have existed and far before that, things have had to fear other things. There were threats out there that if they were near you, they could kill you. So what fear does is it keeps you away from those things that could do you harm. Now, fears are, we develop many fears kind of through experience. So if you interact with something, say you had a childhood experience. I actually had a childhood experience where at one point there was a dog that got loose from a house and it was running straight at me. And it was very terrifying to me. I'd never seen a loose dog before at that point. And so this dog was coming at me and it looked angry, it was barking, it was baring its teeth. And so I had the very kind of gut response of kind of spread my legs, get lower, get ready for an attack essentially. Eventually nothing happened, but after that I was very cautious around dogs that didn't have a leash on it. So I learned that fear in that case. But there are some things that you don't necessarily have to learn. There are fears that we either come pre-equipped with, that you have it from birth, or that if you don't have it from birth, you learn it very, very, very quickly, even after one instance of it. So let me give you an example of a fear that you might have. And I apologize to anyone if this makes you squeamish or whatnot. All right, let's imagine you go out for a night on the town, you have a good old time, you come back really late, it's like 3 a.m., okay? You come back, you kind of walk into your front door, and you go inside, you kind of, you're a little something, you're not in your best mind, and you turn on the lights, and immediately in the corner, up top left, you look and you see this sitting there right for you. Okay, I'll take that away for anyone who doesn't like that. A lot of people fear spiders. Not only do people who have experienced spiders tend to fear spiders, even those who have had minimal experience with spiders can develop these very intense fears of them. Something about that shape where you have kind of a dark body in the center and then you have these long spindly legs coming out, and especially if, I'm sorry to describe this in such detail, but even those small little ones that are coming out of an egg sac where they can skitter around everywhere, even talking about it, you don't even have to see it, just thinking about it can create this intense anxiety in a lot of people. Again, that anxiety is keeping you away from something that could potentially harm you. It's a good thing that you're afraid of spiders. And so what has happened is, across many generations, those who were afraid of spiders tended probably to survive more, because if you get bit by the right kind, or really the wrong kind of spider, that can do some serious harm to you. So we seem to have evolved this adaptation, this psychological fear of spiders, that if you don't already have that fear, people tend to learn it much more quickly than other types of fears. They've actually done a study where they try to teach a relatively young infant to be fearful of two different things. Snakes, the study was actually with snakes, which is another one. Snakes versus flowers. So what they did was they tried to, what they'll usually do is they'll show a picture of something and then they will make a loud noise. Essentially, the child is learning that when this picture shows up, there's going to be a noise that follows, and I don't like that noise. So they learn to fear each of those things based on the fact that a noise will happen. Well, if you try to teach a child to anticipate that noise using a picture of a spider, they learn that fear much more quickly than if you try to teach them that same predicting that a sound is going to come using a flower. We are not prepared to fear flowers because most flowers will not harm us. Most spiders do have some potential to harm us. And so the idea is we are prepared to learn to fear spiders. All right, let me give you another one. So you wake up in the morning, maybe it's the next day after your spider incident. You wake up, you go take a shower, you get something to eat, you're ready to go to work. And so you walk out the front door and you walk down, maybe you have a garage, you go into your garage, and you walk out the front of your garage, and there, sitting in the front driveway of your house is this thing. Okay, all right, I'll take that away. You're not as afraid of a Ferrari, right? I apologize if that's a little loud right now. You're not afraid of a Ferrari, right? So you see a car like that sitting in your driveway, your first response is not, oh my God, it's a Ferrari. In fact, with most cars, you look at a car, there's nothing particularly frightening about it. The thing is, if you really look at the statistics, you should be more afraid of cars than you are of spiders. In this day and age, you are much more likely to die in a car accident than you are to die from a spider bite. Most people, even especially, maybe if you're out in the country, you're in a more rural area, you're going to find a lot more spiders. But again, the vast majority of people now live, at least in the world, within concentrated cities where you're probably going to see less wildlife, and spiders included. And yet, people are more afraid of spiders than they are of cars, where the statistics of getting in a car accident and then that killing you, much higher. Again, why? Why would you be so afraid of spiders and not cars if cars are a greater threat? This is more evidence that spiders were a recurrent adaptive problem in the ancestral human environment. So if those who avoided spiders, they tended to avoid them, they tended to survive. Those who did not fear spiders, they got bit, they died. People were encountering spiders for most of human history. Ferraris were not a recurrent adaptive problem. Cars have only popped up within the past a little more than 100 years at this point. So we just have not, our brains have not had enough time to evolve a new adaptation where we genuinely fear cars in the way that we should. All right, more evidence for fear as an adaptation to this recurrent problem. Food preferences are another interesting psychological adaptation. Think about the things that you prefer, the things that you enjoy eating. So let's go through the list. You have grains, all right? You have meats and dairy. You have sweets. You have vegetables. What am I missing? I feel like I'm missing a few things. But the things that are most enjoyable to eat, what do they tend to contain? So you've got hamburgers, right? Meat tends to be delicious. Sugar tends to be delicious. Anything that's salty tends to be absolutely delicious. But why not vegetables? Why doesn't broccoli taste like heaven on earth? Why doesn't spinach, just get you going in the way that something salty like potato chips do? Why if you fry and salt some kale chips, they're not the same as frying and salting a potato chip? And this has to do with the relative availability of certain foods for most of human history. For most of human history, leaves, greens, vegetables, they were very readily available. If you wanted to eat something that was green and leafy, you could pretty much go outside, find something and eat it. As long as it wasn't poisonous and as long as it wasn't very, very hard to digest, you could eat that stuff. And you weren't going to have a hard time finding it. Meat, fruits, which fruits were the greatest source of sugar before we learned to process sugar and essentially put it in everything that we have. Sugar, and then salt. Salt is one of those things that's not very common. So fats, sugars, carbohydrates, and salts, these are relatively more rare. So what happened is you had two choices. If you have two populations of individuals and one of them has this insatiable desire, they absolutely love fats, sugars, and salts. And then another group that, okay, fats, sugars, and salts, I'll eat them if they're available, but I'm not going to make a big deal out of it. The people who obsessed over fats, sugars, and salts, what they would do is they would gorge themselves on those things when they found them. If you found a bushel full of fruits, you just a peach tree or whatnot, you would just eat all and collect all of those peaches that you could and eat them as quickly as you could before they spoil. Same with meat. Nowadays, you can kind of go to the supermarket and get as much meat as you want for a relatively cheap price. But before modern industrialization, you actually had to go and either hunt those animals or you had to spend a lot of effort farming those animals, right? Feeding them, growing them to the certain size that you could then slaughter them and have your own meat. So meat and sugar and salt, much rarer for most of human history. So our food preferences have evolved in such a way that our brains tell us, if you see something fatty, if you see something sugary, if you find something salty, eat it now and eat lots of it because it may not be there tomorrow. Whereas vegetables, it'll always be there. If you're absolutely starving, if you can't get anything else, just go outside, eat leaves, you'll be fine. You don't need that insatiable desire for leaves, for vegetables. Now, this is unfortunate, right? Because our environment has changed. We are now in an industrialized environment where we can easily get sugar, easily get fat, and easily get salt. But our brains have not changed. Our brains are still equipped to be living in a world where those things are scarce. You can't get those things. So now we have problems like people being overweight or eating too much sugar, too much fat, having heart problems, because our psychology is guiding us to eat as much of that stuff as we possibly can when we don't need to, when we have an overabundance of those things. So this is an example where an adaptation actually used to be very helpful, but now in our modern environment, not so much. Mate preferences are an adaptation. We'll go into this into some detail in the future, but why we find certain people attractive and under what conditions we find them attractive is something that seems to have evolved. So when you find certain traits attractive, I went over at the very beginning, the very first day of class, how people tend to pay attention, if you're looking at someone's face, at cues like sexual dimorphism, so how masculine or feminine a face tends to look, how symmetrical they are, these color cues, and each of those things I linked to health, right? So masculinity, femininity was related to levels of hormones. Hormones during puberty, to actually go through puberty, it's actually very costly. You need to have a certain amount of fat on your body to do that. Symmetry, if you grew up and you were exposed to a lot of disease, you got sick a lot, you got into a lot of fights, things happened, you had developmental problems, such that you became more asymmetrical. If you were more asymmetrical, it's an index that maybe you are less capable of resisting disease or less capable of resisting bodily harm. Well, if you are looking for a partner to reproduce with, to make a copy of yourself with, and your child has to be 50% of someone else, you should want to seek out someone who has traits that you would want in your children. So you would want someone who has a good immune system. You would want someone who is in a position where they're capable of putting on the right amount of fat to go through puberty and to go through reproductive maturation. Likewise, when someone seems to be unhealthy, when someone seems to have a trait that would not be good in a child, not only do we not feel attracted to them, you might even feel disgust, right? Someone who maybe is missing a lot of teeth, who looks like they have some kind of skin disease, things like this, not only do we tend to say, okay, I don't really want to be in a relationship with them, but you might have that kind of, that same reaction that would keep you away from disease, that would keep you away from interacting with feces, just interacting with something that rotten meat, spoiled food. That same disgust response is used for staying away from people who you may not want to be sexually connected to or have sex with, produce children with. So our mate preferences seem to follow this same logic, where people who were attracted to people who had these healthy traits, these color cues to health, this symmetry, tended to produce children that were then healthier. Incest avoidance and inbreeding depression. This is a big one. Most people across the globe, and there are some exceptions to this, and some important exceptions where I think there's new research being done that's kind of challenging how ubiquitous incest avoidance is. But in general, incest is something that, so incest is having sex with, or especially reproducing with, someone who's genetically related to you. So this is having sex with a brother or sister and producing children with your brother or sister. The problem with incest is that you tend to have an increased chance of passing on any genetic diseases that are housed within the family. So this is pretty common, especially I know certain Jewish populations have something called Tay-Sachs disease. And Tay-Sachs disease is something that is only absolutely likely to kill you if you acquire 2 copies of the genes that carry the disease. So that is, if you inherit the gene both from the mother and from the father. Well, you're going to be more likely to inherit those 2 genes if the mother and the father are from the same gene pool. They already have that disease within their lineage. So if you reproduce with someone who's in the same family, you have a greater likelihood of passing on genetic disease. That is what's called inbreeding depression. So inbreeding depression is the greater likelihood to pass on genetic disease from incest. So we tend to avoid incest. We tend to, again, disgust is a big thing here. We tend to feel greater disgust towards the idea of having sex with a brother or sister, or having sex with our parents, or having sex with our children, right? There's something, for most people, there is an instinctual disgust towards that, and that keeps you away from producing offspring that might have that genetic disease. Jealousy is another adaptation. Jealousy is something that you feel in a very particular situation. The situation is someone might be trying to steal your partner. What jealousy does is it motivates you to engage in behavior, engage in those mate retention behaviors, which I mentioned in the introduction. Engage in mate retention behaviors, which prevent your partner from straying or prevent your partner from mating with anyone other than you. There's a very well documented literature on jealousy, and we'll likely talk quite a bit about that as the class goes on. I know a fair amount about jealousy. So those are some adaptations. Again, there are tons of them, but that's just a smattering. Those are probably the adaptations for which we have the greatest evidence. Now, I want to introduce something called a concept known as the vestigial trait. And this is when a trait has historically enhanced reproduction. That is, historically, it was an adaptation. But it does not do so in the modern environment. Food preferences would be an example of this, where before, if you didn't have good access to fat, sugar, salt, those who craved those things would eat as much of it as they could when they could get it. Now, in a modern environment, having that desire for salt, fat, and sugar is killing you. It's killing most people more than it's really helping them. So if you think about some of the changes that have occurred, we have urbanized environments, so people are closer together. We have greater food availability. We have, for example, one of the kind of adaptations that is argued to have been passed on is being skeptical of people who are different than you. So if you trusted family, trusted people who were genetically related to you, and therefore trusted people who looked like you, that was probably your best bet. And if someone looked different than you, it's possible that you couldn't have trusted them as much. Well, now we live in these urbanized environments where we have many different people interacting with one another, and everyone is pretty well motivated to get along in order to survive and prosper and thrive. And so some of the instinctual xenophobic feelings, xenophobia meaning kind of fear of outsiders, those kinds of feelings may actually have helped protect someone in our ancestral environment, but now that we're living in these highly urbanized environments, not so much. Social media technology could be another, this is something that has drastically changed within the last several years. Food regulations, these are recent changes, so we may not have to feel as much disgust towards certain types of foods as we used to, because we have a federal agency that makes sure that the food that gets put on the market does not have things, hopefully, does not have things that are going to harm us. And so that disgust response that we might have to, the meat that you get at the supermarket, the ground meat, how it's all pink, it's not naturally that pink. What they do is they usually add some coloration to it to make it appear more palatable than it is. Same with rice. Rice is naturally brown. It's not white. They bleach rice. But it's because people are less likely to buy rice that doesn't look pristine and perfect. They realized if you bleach rice, if you make it look pretty, people have less of that disgust response, or less of that, oh, I don't know if I can really trust that rice there, if you make it uniform and white. So those changes are kind of sometimes messing with, or these changes are clashing with adaptations that used to be helpful, and they're not so helpful anymore. And the idea here, again, is that brains are not evolving quickly enough to efficiently deal with new and modern problems. So that is, some traits that were adaptations may now be costly to have. And one of the arguments I'm going to make in this class is that atypical sexual behavior, that is, things that we look at and say, oh, that's not the norm. Things like consensual non-monogamy, or having multiple romantic or sexual relationships, or certain atypical sexual practices, things like fetishes or kinks. These were all things that perhaps in the past actually kept us safe to some degree, but in a modern environment, those same intuitions may not be serving us as well as they used to. And so disgust, that kind of like, oh, what, you're into that? Or how could you be in a relationship with multiple people at once? Don't you spread disease? Those kinds of reactions we now have solutions to beyond disgust. So the disgust may not be helping us as much as it used to. Okay. I hope that gives you some indication of how evolution may have shaped our psychology in general. In the next lecture, we'll look at whether evolution has shaped specifically our sexual psychology, which is what we'll be focusing on for the rest of the class.